A racist teacher bullied his black student, mocking her dreams and tearing down her confidence. But when she finally revealed her secret invention, the entire school gasped. Because what happened next changed everything. The fluorescent lights in Mr. Whitmore's classroom buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the rows of desks. It was the kind of old, worn-down classroom where hope seemed to shrink under the weight of years of disappointment. Posters of historical figures, mostly white men, lined the walls, their expressions stern, their accomplishments lauded. At the back of the room, Aaliyah Carter sat with her head down, doodling absent-mindedly in her notebook. She wasn't like the other kids in her senior class, where they saw the future as a path paved with predictability, college, jobs, life. Aaliyah saw the world as a puzzle waiting to be solved, but not everyone shared her vision. "Ms. Carter." Mr. Whitmore's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His tone was sharp, impatient, and laced with something colder, something that made Aaliyah's stomach tighten. She slowly looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice careful. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses and sighed dramatically, shaking his head as if addressing her was an exhausting task. "Perhaps you'd like to share your grand invention with the class," he said, his lips curling into a sneer. The other students chuckled quietly, sensing blood in the water. Aaliyah felt her cheeks burn. She had made the mistake of answering too enthusiastically in class last week, talking about a project she had been working on in her garage, a new form of renewable energy that could revolutionize battery life. She had explained the mechanics of it, how she had reverse-engineered existing lithium cells, and why her prototype had the potential to change industries. Mr. Whitmore hadn't been impressed. "You know, Ms. Carter," he continued, his voice condescending, "it's one thing to dream, but let's be realistic. People like you don't change the world." The room went silent. Aaliyah felt the air grow heavy, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. "People like you." She had heard it before. "People like you don't get into Ivy League schools. People like you don't lead companies. People like you should be grateful to even be here." Mother had warned her about men like Mr. Whitmore, men who disguised their bigotry in the language of reality checks, men who thought they were doing a favor by setting limits. Aaliyah straightened her back, her heart pounding. "With all due respect, sir," she said, keeping her voice even, "I believe history proves otherwise." The class tensed. Mr. Whitmore's eyes darkened. "History?" he scoffed. "And what history do you mean exactly?" Aaliyah's pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. Katherine Johnson helped put men on the moon. Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson's research led to fiber optic cables. Marie Van Britten Brown invented the first home security system. She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. And they were all women. They were all black. A hush fell over the room. Mr. Whitmore's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before returning, tighter than before. "Ah, but those are exceptions," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Outliers. The real world isn't so kind. You should focus on something achievable. Something achievable." The words stung more than Aaliyah wanted to admit. He saw her as small, and no matter how brilliant she was, he had already decided that she would never be more than that. The bell rang, releasing the tension in the air. Students shuffled out, some avoiding her gaze, others whispering as they left. Aaliyah stayed behind, slowly packing her bag, her hands trembling. She had spent years proving people wrong, but why did it still hurt? As she walked toward the door, Mr. Whitmore called out to her. "Aaliyah." She paused, gripping the strap of her backpack. "Don't waste your time on things beyond your reach," he said, his voice softer now, almost pitying. "You'll only be disappointed." Aaliyah clenched her jaw and nodded once, more for herself than for him. She wasn't going to argue. She wasn't going to fight. She was going to show him. And when she did, the world would never be the same. Aaliyah walked home that afternoon with her hoodie pulled over her head, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Mr. Whitmore's words clung to her like damp clothes, uncomfortable and suffocating. "People like you don't change the world." She had heard it all her life, sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken plainly. Teachers who underestimated her, classmates who dismissed her, neighbors who said she was too ambitious. But this time, something about it hit deeper. Maybe it was the way he said it so confidently, like he was stating a law of the universe. By the time she reached the small, cluttered garage behind her house, she had made a decision. She would change the world. She pulled open the garage door, revealing a space that looked more like a mad scientist's lab than a teenager's workspace. Wires coiled across the floor, stacks of notebooks filled with sketches and calculations lined the shelves, and in the center of it all sat her project, a compact, sleek-looking battery prototype, no bigger than a paperback book. It didn't look like much, but inside was something revolutionary. Aaliyah had spent the past 2 years developing a new energy storage system, one that used a self-replenishing cycle, harnessing kinetic energy from movement. If perfected, it could power phones, laptops, even electric cars without needing to be recharged for years. The world ran on batteries, and she had just designed one that could change everything. She ran her fingers over the cool metal casing, her mind replaying Mr. Whitmore's mocking tone. Let's be realistic. People like you don't change the world. Fine. He didn't have to believe in her. But when she unveiled this, when she proved him and everyone else wrong, they wouldn't have a choice but to believe. She pulled out her laptop and began tweaking the calculations. She had been stuck on one problem: stability. The prototype worked in short bursts, but over time it lost efficiency. If she could crack the last equation, she could make it completely sustainable. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of her keyboard clicking. The garage smelled faintly of oil and burnt metal, but she didn't mind. This was her sanctuary. Then, a knock at the door startled her. Aaliyah. She turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her eyes filled with concern. "You haven't eaten dinner," her mother said, stepping inside. She glanced at the mess of wires and blueprints. "You're working yourself too hard again." Aaliyah sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm close, Mom. I just need to fix one more thing." The mother walked over and crouched beside her, placing a gentle hand on Aaliyah's knee. "Baby, I love how brilliant you are, but I don't want you to forget to live too." Aaliyah smiled faintly but didn't respond. The mother sighed, glancing at the prototype. "This is about that teacher, isn't it?" Aaliyah stiffened. "Mother always knew. He said I was wasting my time." Aaliyah muttered. "That people like me don't change the world." Mother's expression hardened. "And what do we say to people like that?" Aaliyah took a deep breath. "We let success be the loudest response." Mother smiled proudly. "That's right. But success doesn't come from breaking yourself, sweetheart. Get some rest. The work will still be here tomorrow." Aaliyah hesitated, then nodded. Mother kissed her forehead before leaving the garage. She sat there for a long time, staring at her invention, her fingers tracing patterns on the metal. Then, a sudden thought struck her. What if she wasn't thinking big enough? Her original plan had been to present her invention at the upcoming science fair, hoping for recognition. But what if she went beyond that? What if she patented it? What if she sent her research to top tech companies? She opened her laptop again, her exhaustion fading in the face of her growing determination. This wasn't about proving Mr. Whitmore wrong anymore. This was about proving herself right. Aaliyah barely slept that night. The moment inspiration struck, she was wired. Her fingers flying across the keyboard, her mind ablaze with possibilities. She refined her calculations, tweaking variables, running simulations, testing, failing, and testing again. By the time the sun peeked through the cracks in the garage door, she had done it. The prototype was stable. Her heart pounded as she watched the tiny device in front of her, its digital readout glowing a steady green. The battery was holding power without degradation. No overheating, no energy loss. It worked. For a second, she just stared. Then, a slow, incredulous smile spread across her face. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and called the one person she knew would believe in her, her older brother, Marcus. It rang twice before his groggy voice answered. "Aaliyah, do you know what time it is?" "It works," she blurted out, barely able to contain her excitement. "Marcus, the battery. It works. No recharge loss, no instability. I fixed it." There was a pause, then the rustling of sheets as Marcus woke up fully. Wait. You're serious?" "Yes." She laughed, running a hand through her curls. "I'm sending you the data now. You have to look at this." Marcus was a junior engineer at a top tech firm. He had always been Aaliyah's biggest supporter, and the one who told her she wasn't crazy for dreaming big. If he thought her design was viable, she knew it was real. A few minutes passed as he opened the file on his end. Then, in a stunned voice, he whispered, "Aaliyah, this is huge." She exhaled, her pulse hammering. "I need to patent it," she said, pacing the garage. "And I need to get a prototype in front of investors. But I don't even know where to start." "I do," Marcus said, his voice steady. "There's a technology summit happening this weekend in the city. Investors, CEOs, developers. Everyone will be there. You need to go." Aaliyah hesitated. "I don't have an invite." Marcus scoffed. "Since when has that ever stopped you? I'll figure something out. Just be ready." A thrill shot through her. This was real. This was happening. 2 days later, Aaliyah stood outside the towering glass skyscraper where the Future Tech Innovation Summit was taking place. She tugged at the sleeves of her blazer, nerves twisting in her stomach. Marcus had come through. He had found a last-minute opening in a student innovation panel and gotten her in. But now, standing at the entrance, watching powerful men and women in sleek suits stride past her, doubt started creeping in. "People like you don't change the world." Mr. Whitmore's voice slithered into her mind, but she clenched her fists and forced it away. She wasn't here to prove him wrong. She was here to prove herself right. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the strap of her bag, where her prototype rested safely, and walked inside. The panel was intimidating. Aaliyah sat among a group of college-age students, all from top-tier schools, while she was just a high school senior from a public school with no connections. When her turn came, she took the stage, swallowing her fear. The room was packed. Hundreds of eyes staring at her. Investors, engineers, CEOs. Her heart pounded, but she focused on the device in her hands. "My name is Aaliyah Carter," she said, her voice steady. "And this," she held up her battery, "is the future of sustainable energy." The room shifted. Interest sparked in the audience. She dove in, explaining how her invention worked, how it could revolutionize battery life, eliminate energy waste, and reshape industries. The more she spoke, the more confidence filled her voice. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then, applause. Loud, thunderous applause. But it wasn't just the clapping that stunned her, it was the people standing up. Among them was Dr. Raymond Kessler, the CEO of Volt Industries, one of the biggest tech companies in the country. He was watching her with undisguised interest, and then he raised a hand. "Ms. Carter," he called, his voice calm yet commanding. "Who holds the patent for this technology?" Aaliyah's breath caught. I haven't filed it yet," she admitted. Murmurs in the audience grew. Dr. Kessler exchanged glances with his team. Then he smiled. "Let's change that." Within an hour, Aaliyah was sitting across from top industry leaders. She had barely wrapped her head around what was happening when she was suddenly in a conference room, explaining her work in depth. "Your design is brilliant," one investor told her. "This could be a multi-billion-dollar breakthrough." Another leaned forward. "Do you have representation? A legal team?" Aaliyah blinked. No, just me." Dr. Kessler chuckled. "You won't be just you for long." It was dizzying. The offers started pouring in. Mentorships, funding, full scholarships. It was surreal, but the most stunning moment came when Dr. Kessler made an announcement. "We'd like to make Ms. Carter an official intern at Volt Industries," he declared. "We'll help her patent her invention and develop it for mass production." Aaliyah felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her hands shook as she covered her mouth. Tears burned in her eyes. This wasn't a dream. This was real. She had done it. And the world was about to change forever. Aaliyah sat in stunned silence as the room around her buzzed with excitement. She had just been offered a life-changing opportunity. Mentorship at Volt Industries, funding for her invention, and the chance to bring her battery to the world. But even as the excitement swirled around her, she felt a weight settle in her chest. She had spent years fighting to be taken seriously. And now, suddenly, she was at the center of something bigger than she ever imagined. Was she ready for this? She barely noticed as a woman in a sharp navy suit sat beside her. "Aaliyah, I'm Michelle Owens, Volt's chief legal advisor," she said warmly. "I'll walk you through the patent process and make sure you retain full credit for your work." Aaliyah blinked. Thank you," she said, her voice shaky. I don't even know where to start." Michelle smiled. "You already did the hardest part. You believed in your own idea. Now let's make sure no one else tries to claim it as theirs." That was when it hit Aaliyah. If she hadn't taken this leap, if she had listened to people like Mr. Whitmore, she might have lost everything. She took a deep breath. "I want to protect my work," she said firmly. "And I want to make sure this technology reaches the people who need it most, not just the corporations who can afford it." Michelle nodded approvingly. Spoken like a true innovator. 2 weeks later, Aaliyah found herself standing in front of her entire school, clutching a folder filled with legal documents. Her invention was officially patented. Her name, Aaliyah Carter, was listed as the sole inventor of the first self-replenishing kinetic battery. And she was about to show everyone. The principal had invited her to speak at a school assembly after hearing about her achievement. But the person she was really here for, the one person she couldn't wait to see react, was standing off to the side of the auditorium, Mr. Whitmore. She could feel his eyes on her as she stepped onto the stage. Taking a deep breath, she looked out at the sea of students. 3 weeks ago, I sat in a classroom where someone told me that people like me don't change the world, she began. A murmur spread through the crowd. But today, I'm here to tell you that the only thing standing between you and your dreams is whether or not you choose to believe in yourself. She pulled the sleek prototype battery from her bag and held it up. "This is my invention. A kinetic energy battery that doesn't need to be recharged for years." Gasps rippled through the room. "This technology is now patented and in development with one of the world's leading tech firms," she continued. "And do you know why? Because I didn't listen to the people who told me I couldn't." Silence fell over the crowd. Then, thunderous applause. Aaliyah's chest swelled as she saw her peers, the same ones who had laughed along with Mr. Whitmore weeks ago, now looking at her with awe. She turned her gaze to Mr. Whitmore. His face was unreadable, but there was no dismissive smirk, no mocking laughter, just stunned silence. For the first time, he had nothing to say. Aaliyah lifted her chin and smiled, because she had already said everything that needed to be said. Aaliyah barely had time to process everything that happened after the assembly. Students who had never spoken to her before suddenly crowded around, bombarding her with questions. "You're really working with Volt Industries? Can you show me how it works? Wait, so does this mean you're going to be rich?" She laughed, shaking her head. "It's not about money," she told them. "It's about creating something that can change lives." Even students who had ignored her or whispered behind her back now looked at her differently, not as some nerdy, overly ambitious girl, but as someone who had done the impossible. The moment that truly stayed with her came later that afternoon. She was packing up her things from the garage when she heard a hesitant knock at the door. Turning around, she froze. It was Mr. Whitmore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The same teacher who had spent the last year belittling her, mocking her, doubting her, now stood in front of her, looking uncertain. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "May I come in?" She hesitated. Then, curiosity got the better of her. "Sure." He stepped inside, glancing around at the organized chaos of her workspace. Blueprints pinned to the walls, notebooks stacked in piles, half-finished projects scattered across the workbench. "You really did all this yourself?" he asked, almost to himself. Aaliyah folded her arms. "I told you I could." He nodded slowly, still scanning the room. "I suppose you did." There was a long pause. Then finally, he sighed. "I owe you an apology." Aaliyah's breath caught. She had imagined this moment before, but never thought it would actually happen. "I misjudged you," Mr. Whitmore admitted, his gaze dropping. "I let my own biases make me believe that you weren't capable of something this groundbreaking, and I was wrong." Aaliyah studied him carefully. She had spent so long fighting against him, against the weight of his doubts, that she didn't know how to respond to this new version of him, a humbled one. So she took a slow breath. "I wasn't looking for your approval," she said, her voice steady. "I was going to succeed with or without it." Mr. Whitmore nodded. "I see that now." He hesitated. "I just hope that, moving forward, I can do better, and maybe learn something from you." Aaliyah stared at him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. "Then start by believing in the next student who reminds you of me," she said. He took her hand, shaking it firmly. "I will." Months later, Aaliyah stood in the Volt Industries headquarters, looking out over the city skyline. The past few months had been a whirlwind. meetings with top engineers, refining her design, preparing for mass production. Her invention was set to launch globally, starting with rural communities that lacked access to sustainable energy. She had done it. She had changed the world. As she stood there, her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "Turn on the news." She grabbed the remote and flipped to the channel. A reporter stood outside a high school, microphone in hand. Her high school. "A new STEM initiative has been announced at Eastwood High," the reporter said. Thanks to a generous grant from Volt Industries, led by their youngest ever innovator, Aaliyah Carter, students will now have access to state-of-the-art technology labs and mentorship programs designed to help the next generation of young scientists. The screen cut to footage of students in her old classroom, sitting at brand new workstations, building, experimenting, dreaming. Aaliyah felt tears sting her eyes. She had built something bigger than just a battery. She had built opportunity. And she knew, without a doubt, somewhere in that room, there was another kid like her. A kid who had been told they couldn't. A kid who just needed proof that they could. And this time, the world would be ready to listen.